So we're continuing on in our social and political theory unit. And there are a bunch of different things that we could talk about in this unit. But y'all voted on discussing the topic of immigration. So we're basically going to look at the social, political, and ethical ramifications of immigration in general and mass migration in particular today. And to do that, I asked you to read an essay by a philosopher named David Miller, who tries to provide a rational case that certain limits should be placed on immigration. I'll start by giving just kind of a general overview of why this is an issue today and why it's something that we should perhaps talk about or at least think about. And then we'll get into the claims that he makes in this article, the kind of defense that he puts up for placing limits on immigration. As you all know, or should know, in the United States we live in what's called a democratically liberal society. This is one that places emphasis on individual rights, liberties, toleration, freedom, and historically for a long time, the United States was held up as a desirable place that people may want to emigrate to in order to build lives for themselves, for their families, for future generations. Within the last few centuries, technological advancement and globalization have made it possible to immigrate to other countries fairly easily. At least the means of doing so are not so obtuse and difficult. And more acceptable. It's generally accepted that, yeah, immigration is something that's good, that people want to pursue, and we've encouraged people to do this. Especially in the US, right, within the last few hundred years. Our society, in particular, is an amalgamation of several different peoples, cultures, values, and ways of life. Most, if not everybody in this room, had or have ancestors that immigrated here from different places around the world, right? Western and Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, Canada, Mexico, Australia, so on and so forth. The U.S. has been touted as the great melting pot, right, of all these different cultures and peoples and ways of life. Unsurprisingly, though, this is a touchy subject, right? It is difficult to outline why we should have strict immigration policies without putting other social groups or peoples and cultures down, right? There's this general idea that, look, we don't want to shit on other cultures or beliefs or ways of life. And so it makes talking about this kind of stuff difficult because we don't want to offend anybody. But there are a lot of people who think that completely open borders is not a sustainable political policy. Thus, though we want to give others the opportunity to escape suffering and live with us in our country, as we'll see, there are downsides to immigration in general and mass migration in particular. So the article that we're going to be looking at today by David Miller is one in which he's going to try to provide an analysis and a defense of placing certain restrictions on immigration. And that's basically what his goal is in this piece. In this article, he wants to explain why, quote, nation states may be justified in imposing restrictive immigration policies. Hence the title of this article, Immigration, a case for limits. Miller hopes to show that arguments for unlimited immigration fail, and he's going to try to provide justifiable reasons for nation states limiting immigration. And then near the end of class, I'll also be providing some other arguments that various people have given in defense of placing certain limits on immigration that Miller does not bring up in this article. And I hope to have a conversation about all this stuff. So the first thing that we're going to look at is Miller's treatment of what is called unlimited movement. It's been argued by a lot of people that, look, this whole idea of borders is stupid. People should be able to move wherever they want. Any society around the globe, any country, let's say, should accept people. We shouldn't bar anybody from moving to any country that they wish to. This is called the argument for unlimited movement. The first thing that Miller tries to do in this article is show why this argument is not a good one. That it's based on claims that are not, let's say, legally supported, that people do not have a moral obligation to accept any and all people from other countries. Thus, this argument states, people should have the right to choose where they live, unless, obviously, doing so would produce disastrous consequences for the people already living there. He says that many of the arguments for this right are very weak. And I'll start writing them over here so y'all can see better. First, he says, yes, it's true that a lot of people have a desire to be able to move freely wherever they want, but that desire itself, what we might say desire simplicatur, or only, does not provide the necessary justification for the right to totally free movement. He brings up a lot of different examples of this. He says, even in societies, our movement is restricted for a variety of reasons. I cannot move into a space that you are occupying. You can't go wherever you want. You can't just enter a person's home, right, without their permission. People generally don't accept that. You wouldn't want somebody entering your home. So it seems like there are justifiable reasons for limiting people's movement. Simply having the desire to move to a different country does not provide the necessary justification for the right to totally free movement, where in the majority of cases, one state offers basic rights. So it's hard to motivate this idea that anybody should be able to move wherever they want, because we already place justifiable restrictions on movement, and there might be good reasons why we might deny people moving into a particular country. for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about today. He's not talking about refugees that are fleeing from war here. What he's talking about is, look, if you have a country that offers its inhabitants basic rights, then there doesn't really seem to be a reason why we should accept people from those countries willy-nilly, without having some sort of policy or vetting process. It's not as if these people are fleeing a country in which they are being oppressed. It seems that their country meets the minimum standard of livability. So he talks about this on pages 195 and 166. The idea of a right to freedom of movement is not in itself objectionable. We are talking here about what are usually called basic rights or human rights, and I shall assume that such rights are justified by pointing to the vital interests they protect. Okay. They correspond to conditions in whose absence human beings cannot live decent lives, no matter what particular values and plans of life they choose to pursue. Being able to move freely in physical space is just such a condition. And as we can see by thinking about people whose legs are shackled or who are confined in small spaces. A wider freedom of movement can also be justified by thinking about the interests that it serves instrumentally. If I cannot move about over a fairly wide area, it may be impossible for me to find a job, to practice my religion, to find a suitable marriage partner, since these all qualify as vital interests. It is fairly clear that freedom of movement qualifies as a basic human right. So people generally should be free to move, right? If you're not able to exercise your freedom of movement, you're not going to be able to live a good life. But here's the kicker. What is less clear is the physical extent of that right, in the sense of how much of the Earth's surface I must be able to move to in order to say that I enjoy it. Even in liberal societies that make no attempt to confine people within particular geographical areas, freedom of movement is severely restricted in a number of ways. I cannot, in general, move to places that other people's bodies now occupy. I cannot just push them aside. I cannot move onto private property without the consent of its owner, except perhaps in emergencies or where a special right of access exists. And since most land is privately owned, this means that a large proportion of physical space does not fall within the ambit of a right to free movement. Even access to public space is heavily regulated. There are traffic laws that tell me where and at what speed I may drive a car. Parks have opening and closing hours. The police can control my movements up and down the streets to a certain degree, and so forth. These are all very familiar observations, but they are worth making simply to highlight how hedged about with qualifications the existing right of free movement in liberal societies actually is. Yet few would argue that because of these limitations, people in these societies are deprived of one of their basic human rights. Some liberals might argue in favor of expanding the right. For instance, in Britain, there has been a protracted campaign to establish a legal right to roam on uncultivated property, privately owned land such as moors and fells. But even the advocates of such a right would be hard-pressed to show that some vital interest was being injured by more restrictive property laws that have existed up to now. The point here is that liberal societies in general offer their members sufficient freedom of movement to protect the interests that the human right to free movement is intended to protect. So how could one attempt to show that the right in question must include the right to move to some other country and settle there? What vital interest requires the right to be interpreted in such a wide way? Contingently, of course, it may be true that moving to another country is the only way for an individual to escape persecution, to find work, to obtain necessary medical care, and so forth. In these circumstances, the person concerned may have the right to move. Not to any state that she chooses, but to some state where these interests can be protected. But here the right to move serves only as a remedial right. Its existence depends on the fact that the person's vital interests cannot be secured in the country where she currently resides. Our present world is not a world of decent states where all countries offer these things to people and protect their vital interests. And this gives rise to the issue of refugees, which I shall discuss later. But if we leave aside for the moment cases where the right to move freely across borders depends upon the right to avoid persecution, starvation, or other threats to basic interests, how might we try to give it a more general rationale? Thus, basically what Miller is saying here is we accept restrictions on freedom of movement within society. It would be hard to argue for unlimited free movement in cases in which people's vital interests are not being threatened. A convincing case hasn't been made for that. He also says that insofar as people have the right to exist and not have their vital interests threatened, this does not imply that people should be able to enter any society that they want. Setting aside cases of war, starvation, oppression, persecution, just because people have some sort of right to have their vital interests protected doesn't give them the right to enter whatever country that they want to. There might be good reasons, as we'll see, to restrict migration. One of these, for example, is going to be like cultural erosion. I mean, think about what has happened in the United States in particular. Native American cultures and languages are dying out as a result of, well, people moving in and killing them and assimilating Native Americans into the wider liberal culture. The final thing that he brings to bear on this is that while we have this ideal view that people should be able to move wherever they want and that this is a good thing, he says actually there's data to support that it's not. Allowing and supporting totally free migration may make people worse off and fail to fix matters of global injustice. He talks about this on pages 198 to 199. I'm sorry, I'm going to read another section here for you. I know it's not exciting. is it nonetheless unfair if people's opportunities are unequal in this way, in the way that the country that they live in doesn't offer them the same opportunities as others? That depends upon what we believe about the scope of distributive justice, the kind of justice that involves comparing how well different people are faring by some standard. According to Michael Walzer, quote, "The idea of distributive justice presupposes a bounded world within which distributions take place, a group of people committed to dividing, exchanging, and sharing social goods, first of all among themselves." The main reason that Walzer gives for this view is that the very goods whose distribution is a matter of justice gain their meaning and value within particular political communities. Another relevant consideration is that the stock of goods that is available at any given time to be divided up will depend upon the past history of the community in question, including decisions about the economic system under which production will take place. These considerations tell against the view that justice at global level should be understood in terms of the equal distribution at any moment of a single good, whether this good is understood as resources, opportunity, or welfare. The basic rights view avoids these difficulties because it is plausible to think that whatever the cultural views of a particular society and whatever its historical record, no human being should be allowed to fall below the minimum threshold of protection of his or her basic interests. But what if somebody does fall below this threshold? Does this not give him the right to migrate to a place where the minimum level is guaranteed? Perhaps, but it depends on whether the minimum could be provided in the political community he belongs to now, or whether that community is so oppressive or so dysfunctional that escape is the only option. So here we encounter again the issue of refugees, to be discussed in my final section. Meanwhile, the lesson for other states confronted with people whose lives are less than decent is that they have a choice. They must either ensure that the basic rights of such people are protected in the places where they live, by aid or intervention or by some other means, or they must help them to move to other communities where their lives will be better. Simply shutting one's borders and doing nothing else is not a morally defensible option here. People everywhere have a right to a decent life. But before jumping to the conclusion that the way to respond to global injustice is to encourage people whose lives are less than decent to migrate elsewhere, we should consider the fact that this policy will do little to help the very poor, who are unlikely to have the resources to move to a richer, better country. Indeed, a policy of open migration may make such people worse off still, if it allows doctors, engineers, and other professionals to move from economically undeveloped to economically developed societies in search of higher incomes, thereby depriving their countries of origin vital skills. Equalizing opportunity for the few may diminish opportunities for the many. Persisting global injustice does impose on rich states the obligation to make a serious contribution to the relief of global poverty, but in most instances, they should contribute to improving conditions of life on the ground, as it were, rather than bypassing the problem by allowing, inevitably selective, inward migration. So the issue at stake here is this. Everybody has a right to a decent life, right? And insofar as we have the resources to provide that for people, we might think that people should be able to migrate to wherever they want. The problem is, encouraging mass migration doesn't help these countries in any way. What it does is it takes the intelligent, wealthy, skilled people and allows them to move, leaving the poor without any solutions to their problems, their oppression. So unless we in other countries are going to play the global police and go into these countries and try to fix them, which historically hasn't gone well, it seems that encouraging mass migration isn't a solution to the problems of global injustice. there are other things that richer countries like the US should be doing, like actually providing on-the-ground support. Thus, there are 3 reasons Miller thinks that the argument for this right to unlimited movement is not well supported. 1, there are legitimate restrictions on freedom of movement, ones that we accept already. So simply having the desire for free movement isn't enough to justify it, because we have reasons and interests for restricting movement. 2, while people have a right to exist and a right to a decent life, that does not imply that they should be free to move into whatever country they want. What it grants them is the right to exit from oppressive regimes, but not necessarily the right to go wherever the hell they want. And 3, supporting totally free migration isn't going to fix problems of global injustice. It might make those countries worse off. Thus, near the end of this article, the second half of it, Miller provides justifications for limiting immigration. We're going to talk about those now, and then I'll provide some other justifications or arguments that he doesn't talk about in this article, and then we can have a discussion about this whole thing. It is in this last section that we'll also be talking about the problem of war, oppression, and refugees, and what kind of moral and or political obligations we have to those who are being oppressed in other countries. If I could spell, that would be great. Truly is a Monday. The first point that Miller brings up is that countries have an interest in sculpting restrictive immigration policies because nation states have an interest in maintaining a common culture which supports democracy and serves other social goals. In other words, there are good reasons to limit immigration because that might make the society heterogeneous in a way that threatens the political system, the culture, and the social goals of that nation state. He talks about this on pages 200 to 201. The public culture of a country is something that people has an interest in controlling. They want to be able to shape the way that their nation develops, including the values that are contained in the public culture. They may not, of course, succeed. Valued cultural features can be eroded by economic and other forces that evade political control. But they may certainly have good reason to try, and in particular to try to maintain cultural continuity over time, so that they can see themselves as bearers of an identifiable cultural tradition that stretches backward historically. Cultural continuity, it should be stressed, is not the same as cultural rigidity. The most valuable cultures are those that can develop and adapt to new circumstances, including the presence of new subcultures associated with immigrants. Consider the example of language. In many states today, the national language is under pressure from the spread of international languages, especially English. People have an incentive to learn and use one of the international languages for economic and other purposes. And so there is a danger that the national language will wither away over the course of 2 or 3 generations. If this were to happen, one of the community's most important distinguishing characteristics would have disappeared. Its literature would become inaccessible, except in translation, and so forth. So, states in question adopt policies to ensure, for instance, that the national language is used in schools and in the media, and that exposure to foreign languages through imports is restricted. What effect would a significant influx of immigrants who did not already speak the national language have in these circumstances? It is likely that their choice of second language would be English, or one of the other international languages, so their presence would increase the incentive among natives to defect from use of the national language in everyday transactions, and make the project of language preservation harder to carry through. The state has good reason to limit immigration, or at least to differentiate sharply among prospective immigrants between those who speak the national language and those who don't, as the government of Quebec has done in recent years. But language isn't the only feature to which the argument for cultural continuity applies. There is an internal relationship between a nation's culture and its physical shape, its public and religious buildings, the way its towns and villages are laid out, the pattern of the landscape, and so forth. People feel at home in a place, in part, because they can see that their surroundings bear the imprint of past generations whose values were recognizably their own. This doesn't rule out cultural change, but again, it gives a reason for wanting to stay in control of the process, for teaching children to value their cultural heritage, and to regard themselves as having a responsibility to preserve the parts of it that are worth preserving. The "any public culture will do" position ignores this internal connection between the cultural and physical features of the community. So, what is the general idea here? Well, countries, societies have a very strong interest in maintaining their culture, their values, and their ways of life, their religion, their architecture style. All of these things contribute to, for example, what it means to be a German or an Iranian or an Australian. These places have unique cultures, unique values, traditions, rituals, language, ways of life. Thus, the people of a community, of a society, of a country, have a vested interest in propagating forth the worldview, the traditions, the culture that they think is valuable, that they are tied to historically. Mass migration would upset this. We see this happening in the US, for example. Centuries ago, I would say Europeans in particular were much more tied to their heritage and their culture and their tradition. Do you feel particularly tied to your ethnicity or your European culture or your African culture? Whatever it is? Probably not, right? Miller is saying that's kind of a bad thing. We're losing something here. By allowing anybody to move into any society that they wish, cultural erosion occurs. We lose what ties us to our ancestors and what made their lives valuable and meaningful. So that's one issue. That's one justification for limiting mass migration and immigration more specifically. Another one, he says, is that countries have an interest in curtailing national and global population growth for a variety of reasons. To prevent overconsumption of resources, to maintain a certain kind of social life, like we've been seeing, maintain a certain quality of life. The general idea being, allowing immigration, and in particular mass migration, may make societies worse because they're not going to be able to provide for all the people that are moving in. Quality of life may drop. Again, we've already talked about cultural erosion. States have a vested interest in maintaining the population of the people that live there and curtailing, to a certain extent, population growth. He talks about this on page 201. The second reason for states to limit immigration that I want to consider concerns population size. This is a huge and hugely controversial topic, and all I can do here is to sketch an argument that links together the issues of immigration and population control. The latter issue really arises at two different levels: global and national. At the global level, there is a concern, and one that you've probably all heard about, that the carrying capacity of the Earth, how many people the Earth can support, may be stretched to breaking point if the total number of human beings continues to rise as it has over the last century or so. At national level, there's a concern about the effect of population growth on quality of life and the natural environment. Let me look at each level in turn. Although there's disagreement about just how many people the Earth can sustain before resource depletion, the availability of water, for example, we know that there are places across the globe that are already running out of water. In the US, California is not doing so well. These problems become acute. It would be hard to maintain that there is no upper limit. Although projections of population growth over the century ahead indicate a leveling off in the rate of increase, we must also expect increases in the standard of living in the developing world. That will mean that resource consumption per capita will also rise significantly. In such a world, it is in all of our interests that states whose populations are growing rapidly should adopt birth control measures and other policies to restrict the rate of growth, as both China and India have done in past decades. But such states have little or no incentive to adopt such policies if they can export their surplus population through international migration. And since the policies in question are usually unpopular, they have a positive incentive not to pursue them. A viable population policy at global level requires each state to be responsible for stabilizing or even possibly reducing its population over time. And this is going to be impossible to achieve if there are no restrictions on the movement of people between states. So, what is he saying there? Well, unless we get nation states around the globe to start developing certain policies surrounding population growth, what we see is that other countries are going to be incentivized just to export their surplus population to other parts of the world, which isn't going to solve this global resource problem. Okay, it's going to make it worse. But there are also problems at the national level. At national level, the effects of population growth may be less catastrophic, but can still be detrimental to important cultural values. What we think about this issue may be conditioned to some extent by the population density of the state in which we live. Those of us who live in relatively small and crowded states experience daily the way in which the sheer number of our fellow citizens, with their needs for housing, mobility, recreation, and so forth, impacts on the physical environment so that it becomes harder to enjoy access to open space, to move from place to place without encountering congestion, to preserve important wildlife habitats, and so on. It's true, of course, that the problems arise not simply from population size, but also from a population that wants to live a certain way, to move around a lot, to have high levels of consumption, and so on. So we could deal with them by collectively changing the way that we live, rather than restricting or reducing population size. Perhaps we should. But this, it seems to me, is a matter for political decision. Members of a territorial community have the right to decide whether to restrict their numbers or to live in a more ecologically and humanely sound way, or to do neither and bear the costs of high consumption, high mobility lifestyle in a crowded territory. If restricting numbers is part of the solution, then controlling immigration is a natural corollary. So the general worry is, if there aren't limits placed on immigration, that's going to have bad downstream effects, not only on the environment, but also on housing prices, which we'll talk about later, resource consumption, quality of life in various places. Miller, at the end of this article, tries to buttress all of this stuff with a discussion about what an ethical immigration policy would look like. So I'll talk about that, list some of the other considerations people have been talking about in regards to this issue, and then we'll see what you all think. As you'll see, Miller is not somebody who wants to restrict or outlaw any and all immigration, okay? He just says that there are certain considerations, factors that need to come into play. He admits right at the beginning of this section, nation states have certain obligations to admit refugees, people who are fleeing oppression, war, starvation, lack of basic human rights. He's not disagreeing with that. But there are a bunch of different considerations that we should think about as to how far this obligation extends and what it looks like. The nature of such obligations should be dependent on population, population density. What are the odds that the immigrants are going to be able to assimilate into the culture and the society? How much it costs to provide this aid? All of these things. I need to get a new piece of chalk. This one's getting to be too tiny. This one's also tiny. What does he have in mind? Well, something like this. Look, let's say your city is bursting at its seams. In the U.S., I don't know, let's talk about New York City or something. Traffic sucks there. Housing prices have increased a lot. It has a lot of awesome historical monuments and history and a culture. But there's a certain quality of life that can be achieved as population increases. Let's say in the next 10 years, it becomes sucky to live in New York. Whether or not the U.S. and New York City in particular should accept immigrants should be based on, well, how many people already live there? How many people are we cramming into this small area? Are the immigrants going to be able to assimilate into New York culture or not? Are there going to be worries about conflicts between different social groups? How much is it going to cost the people of New York City to accommodate these people? These are all considerations he thinks that should come into play when we're talking about immigration policy. Thus, he says that nation states in general should be given autonomy in this matter. Because of the aforementioned reasons, we should not force other countries to accept people that they cannot accept or perhaps do not want to accept if those people have other viable options. But he's going to say richer developed countries still do have some sort of obligation to provide aid for those that are not able to live a decent life if it is not of significant cost to them. Another perhaps controversial thing that he says, but maybe you'll agree with him by the time I list the reasons, is he says nation states can justifiably discriminate against non-refugees in some cases. They are not obligated to accept any and everyone. What do you think some of these considerations might be? What are justifiable reasons not to accept any and everyone? Well, we've already put some of them on the board, right? Is a country obligated to accept in people who are not going to assimilate to the culture, pay their taxes, and live according to the laws of the country? He's like, no, that would be stupid. Like, yeah, if you think a certain person is going to cause trouble, they're not going to obey the laws, you don't have to accept them into your country. Duh. That's just one example, right? If they're not going to play by the rules and treat other people well, you're not obligated to accept them if they're not a refugee. Okay? Similarly, insofar as people have a lot of countries to choose from that offer basic human rights to people, right? We can talk about the countries in Europe, all of those, the United States, Canada, Australia. Perhaps countries can discriminate on whether or not immigrants are going to add any value to their society. If they have other options, why does the U.S. have to accept people who are going to make their society worse? Remember, he's talking about non-refugees here, okay? People who aren't seeking escape or asylum. Just people who are looking to move, okay? Finally, we can generalize. Another consideration that might, be a justifiable basis to discriminate against who is allowed into the country is the cost of immigrating these people. How many resources is it going to take? Is the crime going to go up? These different things. How much is it going to increase population density in a certain area, raise housing prices? What kind of impact is it going to have on the environment? Is it going to decrease the quality of life in the area into which these people want to move? And here's an important caveat, though. And perhaps I should have led with this, because you're probably all thinking this Miller guy is like a racist bad guy. He says race, gender, and sex are not justifiable grounds to discriminate. So you can't just say, people from Asia are not allowed in the U.S. because they're Asian. He's like, that's not a justifiable basis for discrimination. So he doesn't think people can discriminate when it comes to who we let into a country based on sex, race, or other insignificant factors. For example, it wouldn't be justifiable to say no right-handed people are allowed to immigrate to the U.S. That would be an insignificant factor, okay? So, if, for example, Canada had an immigration policy that said no more men or no more black people, he would say, no, those are not justifiable bases on which to build an immigration policy. That's not ethical. Because he doesn't think that's right, and I probably think he doesn't think those characteristics matter. In general, though, he says that nation states have an obligation to balance their own interests and their inhabitants' interests with the interests of potential immigrants. To put it more simply, when it comes to allowing people to immigrate to countries, and they're not refugees, nation states have an obligation to look out for the interests of the people who are living there already, and the interests of those who want to join the fold. For example, the U.S. government would be violating some sort of ethical and perhaps political obligation not to look at the desires and interests of United States inhabitants before accepting others. They're just like, oh, fuck people who live here, we're just going to let whoever wants to come. He's like, no, that's not what a nation state is supposed to do. They should balance the interests of the people with those that are looking to come in. What people argue about is, well, what exactly does that look like? How do we carry that out? Whose interests matter more, etc.? What are those interests? Okay. Let me now just put a few more things on the board, and then we can talk about this. Miller only considers a few general arguments for restricting immigration. It would be good to get on the table what other people have put forth as arguments for restrictive immigration policy. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll talk about, well, are these really problems? How much of problems are they? How do we think about this stuff? What do we think? We've already talked about a few of these. One of them is cultural erosion. The way that we could think about that is like gentrification on a mass scale. Right? We talk about how gentrification is bad. Cultural erosion is a more general, wide-scale way of talking about that. Dissolution of a people's culture, tradition, history, values, language, etc. The basic presupposition is this. Cultural diversity is a good thing. Differing cultures add value to human life. Italian is a beautiful language. The language that is spoken in other parts of the world are awesome too, and offer their own unique worldviews. The traditions that have grown up in Louisiana for the past few hundred years are unique and cool in their own right. What people are worried about is if we accept too many immigrants into a country or community, those things, those unique cultural aspects of a place are going to die out. They're going to dissolve away. Because the people living there, well, are no longer the people that have been living there for hundreds of years, practicing certain traditions and rituals. We can use Native American culture as a great example. There are a lot of different Native American cultures and languages. Not very many people speak them in the U.S. anymore due to a lot of bad things. That's not good, right? generally we want to maintain these cultural traditions. The idea is that mass migration and immigration in general affects our ability to do that. Another thing that Miller brought up, although he didn't talk about this specifically, is environmental degradation caused by overpopulation. How do you spell that? I can't spell today. Loss of habitats, ecosystems, biodiversity, etc. As more and more people enter a certain space, cities, communities, towns need to expand in order to accommodate them. They need to expand into nature. That threatens the creatures that are living there. It's a very slow process, but I think I was reading something like almost 40% of the species in the US are under threat of extinction due to population growth. Immigration contributes to population growth. Another thing that it contributes to is increased costs of housing and rent. As more and more people are funneled into a space or a city, the demand for housing skyrockets. The supply increases very slowly, driving up the prices. Just look at what's happening in New York right now. There are a ton of people living in New York. Apartments cost $2,500 a month, and you're lucky to get that. Immigration contributes to that. It's not the only thing that's contributing to that, mind you. There are a lot of forces at play. We might also mention what some thinkers call the breakdown of politics. Historically, social groups have engaged in politics seeking the common good for themselves as a community. This doesn't seem to be what politics is like nowadays. Nowadays, what we have, for example, in the US, is not everybody aligned on social goals, seeking the common good for everybody else, but various social groups vying for power to acquire resources for themselves. Right? Everybody is trying to get their slice of the pie. They're not really looking out for other social groups, right? Unsurprisingly, because some social groups are racist, right, and don't want them there, and there are conflicts, right? One problem, thus, with immigration is that as you import people of different cultures, languages, values, and ways of life, it's been argued that politics breaks down to fighting between social groups. That's the general argument. unsurprisingly, and perhaps this is a controversial thing, but it seems to be empirically supported, as you import people of different cultures, societies, languages, values, worldviews, that produces more conflict in society. Humans generally have an in-group preference, right? For some people that's racial, for some people that's political, right? If you're not a Democrat, I hate you. If you're not a conservative, get the fuck out of here, right? On account of this, allowing peoples of all different stripes and histories and cultures to immigrate to places, people experience increased alienation on account of their in-group preferences. People are racist. Okay, they don't like people that are not part of their group. That produces conflict, right? It produces conflict because the people that are living now in classically liberal democratic societies don't all share the same values, or political goals, or histories, or worldviews, metaphysics, ways of life, right? All these different social groups and cultures had different views on these things. So they're going to act differently. They're going to engage in different behaviors that conflict with one another, right? Because people generally have a preference for their in-group, I'm not saying this is good, this is just how people work, right? There are racists out there, homophobes. What this results in, it has been argued, is the breakdown of liberty, because as the result of this alienation and conflict, in proliferation of laws, surveillance, and policing becomes necessary to keep everything in line and keep everything ordered. To take an example, 40 years ago, Ireland never would have considered imposing hate speech laws that restrict freedom of speech. Now, you could argue that that's good. Curtailing that kind of absolute free speech is good, but that's a different consideration. What I just mean to bring up here is immigration tends to produce a situation in which people start to fight and have conflicts, and then the government cracks down and makes us all less free, and perhaps even stokes more tensions. There are other arguments than this, but these were some of the big ones that occurred to me as I was researching this. So on account of these, and on account of what Miller had to say earlier, he thinks that there are justifiable reasons for having a restrictive immigration policy. Not that we should completely bar people from entering a country, especially if they're, escaping from war, starvation, oppression, but given the fact that people have a vested interest in maintaining the community in which they live, it would seem that countries have some sort of right to have a limited or restrictive immigration policy. So, what do y'all think about this? Is this right? Is this wrong? Is it stupid to even be having this conversation? It's a hot topic nowadays, right? Here's an interesting idea that my girlfriend actually brought up in the car. It's been argued that insofar as the U.S. has something like an open border policy, that's discriminatory against other people who are non-Mexican and non-Canadian. That's kind of interesting, right? Because people from other countries have to go through this long process of vetting and all this stuff. So it would seem that our policy is discriminatory on those grounds, but maybe that's not bad. I don't know. What do y'all think? Yeah.
I really like this piece because this is generally something that I agree with. But I think the issue is when this specific way of taking the immigration discussion, it's not brought up a lot because especially here, immigration has like this weird it's not synonymous, but a lot of people treat it synonymous to racism.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, I think, the larger issue is that people need to stop thinking about it as oh, we're being racist against people if we're closing our borders or whatever. But that more has to do with the people who are leading and the government and the president and stuff, the people who actually control it.
Okay.
There needs to be less of this I don't know, tie to that because this isn't racist. I don't think this is racist in any means, and I don't think he is. But I think a lot of the issue is that people take it in a racist way when they're talking about it, and they immediately assume that you're oh, well, so you just don't want people of color to be here. That's not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about making sure our country stays safe, our people's culture stays safe, and there's not an overpopulation here. That's a big thing here too. Is we will be running out of resources if we let X amount of people in at a certain point. As much as it sucks, it does. And I think there's also I think you mentioned richer countries also need to play a hand and help ensure that there isn't such a need for immigration here. People need to immigrate here because their home countries are horrible and are dictator regimes or whatever.
Sure. Oh, oppressive. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we feel we have such a moral obligation to let people in if that happens, the refugees, then there's no moral obligation to ensure that home country gets better and we protect those people there instead of having them come over here. And I don't know. I think the topic of conversation needs to change so this conversation specifically happens.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's a touchy subject, right? Because you'll find people who are racist who support strict immigration policies, right? And so people will be like, "Oh, well, that's what I've seen in my life. So it must be that the majority of people who support this are racist, right? Or something like that." So I do think there has been some political messaging that has muddied the waters a little bit. Insofar as that prevents us from having an honest discussion about this and the pros and cons of this, that sucks. Yeah.
I was gonna say to what they said. Even before this was talked about mainstream, I would always be looking up ways that we could try to help them there in their own country, just because it's all this stuff comes into play when you think about it, but it's also I don't know. There's so many other ways we can go about it. They don't have to immigrate here. They can, we could try to, find ways for, I guess, just find ways for us to, help out, in their actual country. I don't know, just because it's there's always going to be, groups of people who don't like immigration, who don't want, other people here. So I think it would be helpful if we could try to find ways to just, actually support them in their own country. I don't know.
So you are kind of partial to his point where he says, if we just encourage and support free immigration anywhere, we're not actually solving the problems that the people are facing there.
Especially because it's regardless, people are still going to be in the country even when it's at its worst. Some people are gonna be able to come here and have a better life, but at the end of the day, there's some people who are still in that country suffering. So I feel there needs to be a way for us to help people who are struggling in those countries, because it doesn't fix the problem. Immigration doesn't fix the problem of their country being, or why they're coming here. So I don't know.
All too often in the past, it seems as if American intervention has been greedy and imperialistic, right, and not actually solving the problems in those places. Yeah, that's a worry that he has too, because he talks about how, like, look, only people with certain resources, wealth, privileges are able to immigrate. And so you're just kind of allowing them to like have more privilege, and you're not actually helping the people who are really suffering there, who are dying, who can't escape their oppressive regime. He's like, maybe we should put more eggs in the basket of doing that rather than just bringing everybody here, or allowing them to come here, rather.
I also feel like we need to make an effort to help the people that have immigrated here. So like, I'm from Vermont, which obviously is like a pretty white state, like let's be real. But like my city has made a big effort over the past like 10 years to be like a safe haven for refugees.
Yeah.
But then when children come, like there's not resources to actually help them like succeed in school where you're learning English. And I feel like we're not even trying. So we let people come and then they struggle because they can't understand like the people around them too.
And that exacerbates these problems.
Yeah. And so then they're like further behind, even though they're in the US, which is like awesome, you made it, but then you're still fighting to like understand your math teacher.
Sure, yeah. So maybe, would you say it would be wise to have, to devote resources not to such a wide immigration policy, but instead to supporting the few who are able to come here?
Yeah.
Okay, if we did have to decide between divvying up resources that way, maybe there's room to do all of this. I don't know. But, okay, yeah, that's a good point. We'll go to you first, yeah.
I feel like the argument that's used against immigration on the aspect of that we would be putting the interest of immigrant groups over people who have already lived in the country.
Yeah.
Like a not so good argument, because that idea could also be used to not support them in their own country. Because we would be focusing on our own people first. So that just like brings up the question, when would we help them?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Do we think that nation states have an obligation to their people first and foremost? I think a lot of people would say that, right? Like, the government of the U.S. should take care of U.S. people first. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? I mean, look at the way that we treat veterans here, right? Or people who are homeless or who are stuck in poverty, right? There are a lot of people suffering here, and it doesn't seem like, their basic rights are being respected. It doesn't seem like they're getting the help that they need. So, an important question arises. Do we have an obligation to help out these people first, before others in oppressive regimes, or not? What do y'all think? Yeah.
I think we try to do both, which I think is good, because we do have people like we have departments in our government that are meant to like oversee some of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think the more of the issue is that there's not enough funding towards those departments, and there's not enough I think, I don't actually know how to do my stuff, but I know there is, for example, there's departments in our government that are meant to oversee foreign affairs. And I know there's proposals that just come ahead of something like that. But I think the issue is there needs to be like a second person that's like strictly that, and like the president is like strictly like US.
Okay.
Like I think there needs to be a better person in power. Not better person in power, but like
Maybe.
maybe a better person in power. But like someone who like gets the same amount of funding that for foreign affairs. Because like we can do both. I think a lot of people
Okay.
don't realize that. It's like it's not like an us versus them thing. It's like, okay, we have the means to do both. It's just the fact that we're not focusing on it because people are so worried that if we focus any of our attention on a foreign affair or anything like that, or like immigration, then immediately we're gonna lose track of the US
Yeah.
we are such a rich country, like there is zero reason for us to be so worried about that. I think there's possibilities for us to do both, and I don't think the conversation should be an us versus them type thing because it's just very limited.
Yeah.
Resources, and it makes it seem like we can't do both. Like that's a very good possibility. I think there needs to be more call for that.
So you're saying, look, we have the means, we have the manpower, we have the wealth to be able to provide for those, to help those in other parts of the world that are not able to live a decent life, and help those who live here, right? But you say it's a problem of, like, look, we're just not doing that. Like, we're not focused on that. What are we? Yeah, I mean, well, what are we focused on? Making money, right? Generally, people want to make money. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, because I'm Canadian, but my family immigrated from Colombia to Canada when I was younger. And while you were reading, you mentioned Quebec.
Yeah.
And I lived in Quebec. And the cultural erosion argument, I just found it really interesting because, like, to some extent, I agree. Like, the country that you're immigrating to, if you're letting in too many people, like, yeah, I see how the culture of that country will be raised, but also, like, the immigrants coming into that country, like, they are going to adopt your traditions and all this as well. Like, we celebrate Thanksgiving, we celebrate like any other Canadian like what's it called, traditions or like festivals or whatever. We will celebrate that. When we live in Quebec, they have like a very like strict like French only like rules. We learn French to live there, and they're like very like I don't kind of discriminatory, and like you feel that as an immigrant, so you want to like kind of assimilate to them as much as you can.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like to some extent, yeah, but like also the immigrants that are immigrating there want to assimilate as much as possible, just so they can like kind of like live and like get by.
Okay. So yeah, you're saying, like, look, let's take like Western countries for example. A lot of people would agree. Immigrants who move here do assimilate to the culture. A lot of people, however, would say they don't actually do that. And the question becomes like, what does this mean? What does it mean to assimilate to the culture? Does it just mean you speak the language, you obey the laws, and you pay your taxes? Or is there something more to it? Because the vast majority of people who move here from other countries, they do speak the language, English, right? They do pay taxes. They do obey the laws. But do members of, let's say, I don't know, the Twin Cities suburbs see their Muslim neighbors as being a part of their group, even if they do all those things? This is a really hard question, right? What does this actually mean? How does one assimilate? What does that entail? This is something people are arguing a lot about nowadays.
I'm not sure how we would define assimilation here, but I just want to add that I basically agree with what she's saying. I feel like the idea of cultural erosion is mostly fear mongering.
Okay.
A lot of like immigrants do end up assimilating, and not only that, the children of immigrants, especially in the country that they were born in, just end up adopting the culture that they were raised in, just based on my experience as the child of immigrants. I feel more in touch with like American culture than Vietnamese culture, just because I was raised here.
Sure.
I went to school here. I speak English much better than I speak Vietnamese. But yeah, I just don't think that the idea of cultural erosion, the country in which the immigrants are moving to would be losing that due to the immigrant influence. And as for immigrants losing their own culture, I'd say, well, the other countries still exist and their culture is still thriving. I don't think that the culture would be lost there either.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so you're not really worried about that. Because you see, and you perhaps experienced it, that you think assimilation is occurring, and there's not, there isn't this erosion that's happening. And maybe some people are making a mountain out of a molehill.
I think I would have to disagree though, just because a lot of my friends, for example, like my, people from, Middle Eastern countries, I feel like when they do, come here and, they get involved in like, our culture and stuff, I feel like sometimes they lose like, their culture, which isn't a bad thing, but I feel like from us, so like, I'm trying to say this, so it's like, when we're younger, like I feel like they were more like, involved in like, their grandparents and their culture, like all their stories and stuff.
Sure.
And then when we would go like, to high school, college, it's kind of like they lost a lot of those, I don't know, I don't want to say morals, but just like, the cultures that they would teach me, if that makes sense. So I feel like
Sure.
sometimes I feel like it could be, lost just because like they do grow up in America and they kind of, I don't know, does that make sense? I just feel like
Yeah, so you're saying like,
sometimes
insofar as like immigrants assimilate,
Yeah.
like they're not practicing or supporting the culture that they come from.
I don't know,
But then a lot of people would say that's what we want, from immigrants. We don't want them to like bring that stuff and like completely change our culture. But then it's like they, maybe there is real value in that stuff that insofar as they're not practicing it, they're losing something. Is there a lot of substance to like American culture, for example? Is there like there is kind of such a thing, but it's so heterogeneous and like.
But then remember what he said? He said like, we're losing some of that, I don't know what he said. He said in the beginning, where you said like, you're not in tune with, your European,
Yeah.
so it's like, I don't know.
I don't know
wish-
anything about my
I don't know
ancestors
anything. So
or
it's like,
which
I don't like that I lost out on that. So it's like when people, do have that, connection with, their heritage and stuff, it's a great thing because you want to know where you came from. So when you lose it, I feel like you kind of lose, I don't want to say yourself, but you kind of like, you lose some of that history that your parents had, that your family had.
Sure. Yeah.
My argument to that is that the other countries still exist. The people in those other countries still exist. If they wanted to, they can try to connect back to their roots. They can talk to their grandparents more. I make an effort to try to communicate with my grandparents as much as possible in their native language because they can't speak English at all.
Sure.
The other country produces media in that language that they could try to learn and seek out more if they really wanted to, I guess, to maintain that connection. Obviously, it's harder because there is a language barrier there and it's not as easy to get access in comparison, but there are resources available, I guess, and depending on the country, it's not uncommon for people to try to move back to those countries to get back in touch with their heritage. I know a lot of South Koreans who grandparents came over because of the Korean War. They were Americanized, they grew up in America. A lot of them are moving back to South Korea, learning the language, assimilating into the South Korean culture there. So I just don't think it's much of an issue on either side, really.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have. So thank you for everybody coming and talking and sharing your views. This was an interesting discussion. I will see you all on Wednesday. Hope you all have a wonderful Halloween.